Hi, this is Mr. Evans. In this video I'm going to look at a question from this section of the specification, which is Unit 2, and it's about understanding the role and importance of stakeholders, and it's the need to consider stakeholder needs when making decisions. So the question, and I've not produced a case study for it, so it could be an all businesses question, particularly prevalent at A-level, but this video will be very useful for AS students too. The question is, to what extent are customers always the most important stakeholder in business decision making? So the instruction is to what extent. It's an evaluation question. You should know that because you know all of the triggers to trigger evaluation. To what extent, discuss. You might have justify as a trigger to trigger evaluation. The focus of the question is stakeholders and knowing stakeholders. But more importantly, it's the actual focus of the question is probably stakeholder mapping. Okay, the concept here that we can use, the most useful business tool that we can use is stakeholder mapping, where the stakeholder power and interest. You should know the stakeholder map, and actually what determines the need to consider stakeholders is the process of stakeholder mapping. So this is actually a question on stakeholder mapping, which you'll pick up on if you know the specification, and that will help you with your answer. Well, what's the context of this? Well, it's all businesses, okay, because the question is always, and we haven't got a specific context other than a business that is going to be making decisions. So all businesses and business decision making is the context of the question. Now, you'll probably get the most out of this video if you just take a minute to maybe pause the video and think about how you would answer the question. Here is a descriptor that I've put together of some of the things that I think are key components of a really good answer, and when I've had a look at the previous answers that AQA have said have got top marks, and these are the kind of things that characteristic of those answers. I've also just picked out some terms from, some points from the examiner's report in 2017. And it does say here, defining terms where it is not specifically asked for is using time which can be used to more effectively answer the question. Okay, having said this, it is important to be very clear and precise about aspects of the concepts being used, and a definition does give you that. So let's be very clear here, the examiner isn't saying don't start with a definition, but they are saying just think before, are you wasting your time by writing that definition? Will you explain the concept later on in the essay? If you are, then there's an argument that you don't have to put it in. Having said all of that, AQA have released plenty of specimen answers that do start with a clear definition. Okay, this comes from the examiner's report. Some students do not help themselves by describing long lists of data. Instead of spending a couple of minutes planning and combining information and then developing the information into a coherent and more succinct paragraph. The key thing here is planning in advance and combining information. This is particularly important when you've got a case study, which I haven't produced for this essay, but plenty of the previous videos that I've done in recent days have had a case study where I've looked at how to combine information. This is important. An effective line of analysis will often direct the argument back to the question itself, having fully explored the point being made. So this is really important for the last sentence of your paragraph. Does the last sentence of your paragraph clearly make sure that your point that you have developed is linked back to the question and therefore answers the question? Finally, all of these points are from the examiner's report. A good judgment answers the question set and links logically to the analysis of the component arguments. In other words, you've used the analysis that you've done in the body of the essay to back up the conclusion that you come to at the end of it, the judgment that you make. Right, and again, this is the examiner's report. Planning responses is essential to achieve this. So I can't emphasise the importance of planning enough. And just making sure you understand the question, this instruction-focused context can help you do that. And again, this is the descriptor of a level 5, 20, 25 mark answer. Now then, so if we just have a look at the question again, to what extent are customers always the most important stakeholder in business decision making? Well, when I took a couple of minutes to plan this on paper, I just put some bullet points as to why customers are usually very important, why they might not be, and then I had a look at some other stakeholders as well. And because of that process, I already know my conclusion to the essay is going to be something like, in the long term, customers are the most important stakeholder, but in the short term, there are arguments that other stakeholders may be important. And that's the shape that my essay is going to take. So let's have a look at what I've put. Well, I have decided not to start with a definition in this case, although arguably I could have started with the definition of stakeholder mapping and done a little bit of signposting to the examiner where I was going to go. The reason I decided not to do that is because in an essay on stakeholders, I would usually try and look at more than 2 stakeholders, so I've got some depth of analysis, and I wanted to save my time in order to do that. So I've not started with a definition. Instead, I've got right on with answering the question, are customers always the most important stakeholder in business decision making? So customers may be considered the most important stakeholder in business decision making in the long term. So that's a very clear statement, and it's signposting the examiner to my conclusion. This is because the customers are the stakeholders who purchase an organisation's goods and services. Look, there's a definition. And without customers, a business will be unable to generate the revenues needed to survive. Okay, fairly basic point. On a stakeholder map, the customers would be considered to have both a high interest in the company and high power. Okay, so I've brought in the concept of stakeholder mapping to back up what I'm saying. This would mean that an organisation should ensure that they consider the impact on and reaction of customers before making any decisions and continue to communicate with them throughout the decision-making process. Okay, so I've taken my point about customers being the people who provide the revenue for an organisation through purchasing their goods and services, and I've developed that through the use of stakeholder mapping and saying why customers should be involved in the decision-making process. But I'm going to try and get some balance in my essay, because one of the things that the examiner wants is a balanced range of issues. So how do I get some balance when I'm talking about stakeholders? Well, I talk about why customers might not be the most important decision making, or why some customers may not be as important. However, there are situations in which some customers are more powerful than others. If one customer accounts for a large proportion of an organisation's sales, perhaps a car manufacturer for a producer of specialised engine parts, this customer's views will be particularly important. Okay, so what I'm saying here is if you've got one customer or one very large customer who account for, say, 80% of your sales, you're going to be really keen to make sure that any decisions that you make satisfy them, because if you lose them as a customer, you're in trouble. Equally, supermarkets such as Tesco have millions of customers. Some customers will only be peripheral to such organisations, and it is arguable that it would be both time-consuming and unnecessary to consult with such customers when making business decisions. So I've given 2 contrasting business scenarios here, which answers the bit of the question about are customers always the most important? Well, some customers are more powerful than others, and so those powerful customers are going to be more important. You'll notice the way that I've used the word powerful. All right, I'm referring back to this concept of stakeholder mapping. Okay, so now I need to consider some other points. I need to consider some other stakeholders, and in the question that's about stakeholders, I would try and talk about a minimum of 2 stakeholders, if not 3 analytical paragraphs on stakeholders. So, some businesses may believe that their shareholders are the most important stakeholder when making business decisions. Okay, so this is a statement. it lets the examiner know that I'm going to discuss shareholders in this paragraph. This is true when one shareholder holds the majority of shares within the company and may therefore have enough influence to be able to overrule any decisions made by the board and their votes through their votes at the AGM. Okay, so this is quite a basic point. Again, it's about the number of shareholders in an organisation. Let's just see how I get some balance in here. However, most public limited companies have a multitude of small investors who do not want to be troubled by the day-to-day running of the business and are therefore content for the management team to make decisions, provided they're confident of making a return on their investment. So what I'm saying here is that if you've got one shareholder with the majority of shares, they're able to overrule any decisions that are made. However, smaller shareholders are content for the management team to make decisions because they've just invested money in a company. These would be people like pension, people with pensions, for example. Those people, there's millions of them literally, and they're not going to get involved in the day-to-day decision making of businesses. So I've got some balance in there. Hopefully I've explained to the examiner I know exactly what a shareholder is, and I've developed a chain of argument that's nicely balanced. Okay, so one more important stakeholder for me to consider before I come to some sort of conclusion. For some businesses, the source of their competitive advantage is their employees. Companies with highly trained, highly skilled, innovative staff like Apple and Google may therefore identify staff as those with the most power over their business. Okay, so I'm referring back again to that stakeholder map through the use of power. This would mean that staff would be heavily involved in decision making, really focusing on the question. This can be seen in Google, as many of their products and strategic direction come from employee innovation. All right, so I need some balance now. However, staff that are low skilled and easily replaceable will inevitably hold less power over companies, and therefore may be less important to consult with over decision making. So hopefully you can see that I've focused the essay on decision making, and for each of these stakeholders I've talked about when they would be powerful and when they might not be powerful. So I've got some balance. So now I need a conclusion, and remember the conclusion should answer the question set, linked logically to analysis, and the conclusion should also show balance and have a clear focus on the question. So let's see how I try and do that. In conclusion, customers are the most important stakeholder to consider when making business decisions. Well, I've clearly answered the question. This is because the survival of a business ultimately depends on them generating revenues from customers. Okay, so I've supported my conclusion with something I've already spoken about up here, which is customers will be able to generate the revenues. But that's not a very high level conclusion so far. All I've got in my conclusion is a judgment, and I've supported it basically with some analysis. So I've got a judgment built on analysis. It's not a very high level conclusion at the moment. What I need to do is get some balance in there. However, in the short term, businesses will need to consider which other stakeholders have high power and high interest in the use of stakeholder mapping. In many instances, keeping other stakeholder groups, like employees, satisfied in the short term will lead to benefits for a business that enable them to satisfy customers in the long term. Okay, so I've brought in here an element of time to show that balance. So you could argue that Google's most important asset are their really innovative staff. And if you consult with them in the short term, those staff will create value for customers, and those customers will be satisfied in the long term. So hopefully you can see how I've tried to incorporate the things that the examiner has told us and to hit as many of the points as possible of this level 5 descriptor.